coming to its. Okay, got it. One moment. Okay, the Underground Railroad was really into its coming into its own. You would see in 1841, you had the New Jersey Anti-Slavery Society had held their first convention in Paterson. Now, I want you to understand, don't confuse the Anti-Slavery Society with the Underground Railroad. The Anti-Slavery Society was an organization designed uh, to destroy or take apart the laws that bound slavery in New Jersey. And I got to tell you, there are more laws in about slaves in New Jersey than you could ever imagine. There are well over 300 laws guarding, I won't say guarding, but as it relates to slavery, or what slaves could and could not do. Um, so 1840, right here in Patterson, you have the 1804, 1841 Anti-Slavery Society Convention, and you have a number of people who sign. And again, it's a state convention, but you have a number of people from Patterson, men from Patterson, who were part of that organization, who signed the legislation that went to New Jersey legislature to abolish slavery. Now, for those who don't know what the anti-slavery who founded it, it is actually found by William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. And they had, by 1845, 1850, there were 1,200 chapters. And of course, I just said it, Patterson had his chapter. 1841, and this happened in January of 1841. And 1841, December, you Josiah Huntoon. Josiah Huntoon is a very heroic figure as it relates to slavery and the Underground Railroad in Patterson. He's born in 1813 in Mount Pelier, Vermont, and leaves home, one of 10 children. He leaves home and goes to work in New York for a grocery store that specializes in coffee. He moves to Patterson again in 1841, and he moves on, he buys a home, and he starts his business, which is a coffee and spice business, in the basement of his home. And while he was doing this work, he also was a freeholder. He was a surveyor. Now, why that's important, because he was getting the lay of the land, and he was getting the lay of the land. By 1840, about 1850, and I got to say this story, and this is going to be a lot of different stories about various people that influenced the Underground Railroad. 1848, you have a young man named Harry Jackson. Harry Jackson was the property of a man, his slave owner named Cornelius Hopper. Cornelius Hopper is from a long line of Hoppers out of Hoppertown. And for those who don't know where Hoppertown is today Hohokus. 1848, Harry Jackson runs away. Now, I believe, and again, I've looked at his history, and I've uh, done some real historic research with this, and I believe that there's one of two ways that he could have got out of Patterson. One along Golfer Road, and Golfer Road takes you from Patterson right to Hoppertown or Hohokus. From there he might have went on to the Ramapo Mountains, where the Ramapo Indians may have hit him and hit him and moved him along. As he moved along, he may have stopped in the town in an area of Sloatsburg. And this area was called, well, it was always referred to, and even today, it is called Nigger Pond, Nigger River, and Nigger Road. Now, why that's important is, and I should have said this earlier, Patterson is unique. It's unique in terms of its ability to move slaves in and out of the city. Patterson is in a valley, but again, what makes it so unique is because it's in a valley, but it's surrounded by 5 rivers: the Ramapo, Pequannock, Wanacue, Passaic, and the Pompton. And all of these rivers were escape routes going north, uh, going north, yeah, basically going north, and they were escape routes to get out of Patterson. It also was the home of three different railroads. It also was the home, or it was also part of the Morris Canal that started in Jersey City and went from Jersey City to Phillipsburg, which is 108 miles. Now, that's very important because yeah, enslaved people would use the canal, Morris Canal, and there are photographs where you can see Africa, you can see enslaved people or free people working the Morris Canal. Now, another reason why the Morris Canal was very important, and again, I'm trying to set this up for geographic reasons, is you had 8 Underground Railroad agents on the Morris Canal, starting in Jersey City and ending in Stanhope, and the station in Stanhope was manned by a woman. Um, Now, the Underground Railroad station in Patterson was manned by Alexander Freeman. Alexander Freeman was a Mason, but not in addition to that, he was a temperance man. He was the president of Patterson's Temperance Society. And I'm telling you that because I'm trying to show you how he was very religious. And he also was a tinsmith, and he also did plumbing. He was a supplier of tin and all kind of things for plumbing. So he was Patterson um, on the Patterson leg of the Morris Canal. Now, as the Underground Railroad grew because of the uh, as it grew, a number of people in Patterson, distinguished people, start becoming part of it. Now, 1850, around the 1850s, you have a young man whose name was William Van Rensselaer, a Black man who was born in Spring Valley, New York. He comes to Patterson. Now, I don't know why, and I've been trying to figure this out and put it together in a way that makes sense to me. Why would he leave Spring Valley to New York, and come south? Even though it's not that far away, he's still coming south. Why I asked that question to myself is because that is when the Fugitive Slave Act was at its height. Those of you who may have watched the movie Slavery, 12 Years a Slave, now you get a better picture of what could have happened by moving around in an unknown territory. So he comes to Patterson. Josiah Huntoon befriends him. They become great friends, and he gives him a job. He actually lives in his basement, and he actually works for him in his coffee business. They become such good friends and such likable. He was such a likable guy that Josiah Huntoon sends him to school in Canada to become. Well, he comes back an engineer, and it's unfortunate that a lot of people think when we talk about the Underground Railroad that you think of William Van Rensselaer as an engineer on a locomotive. He wasn't. He was an engineer. It was similar, but it's not quite the same. He was an engineer. We would call him a fireman today because what he did is he took care of the boilers and the roasters that roasted the coffee and spices in the mill. So he basically was a fireman. We look at firemen today in buildings who control and run the furnaces in our big apartment buildings, office buildings. Those are, in order to do that, you got to get a fireman's license. Anyway, that is what William Van Rensselaer did for Josiah Huntoon. Now, when he comes back from Canada, he may have discovered some Underground Railroad connections and ways how to move the enslaved forward or move them north. So by 1854, the Underground Railroad connection is really starting to become a very important part of Patterson's growth. The first mayor of the city of Patterson, whose name is John Jackson Brown, he's an Underground Railroad agent, but he's also the mayor of the city of Patterson. In later years, by the 1860s, he actually becomes a legislator, and they ask him to go to, I think, it's Chicago for the reelection of Abraham Lincoln. But before I get that far, let me tell you about a few of the men who were on the Underground Railroad, who you have John Jackson Brown. So not only was he the mayor, but he was also a grocer and he was also a banker. He was the first president of the First National Bank in Patterson. You have Henry Lowe. Henry Lowe was a cotton mill owner, and he was a very staunch person in terms of abolitionism, and um, he was a strong anti-slavery man, very strong, and he was also an Underground Railroad agent. But Henry Lowe is also one of the founders of Patterson's Republican Party, not the Republican Party of today, but this is when it kind of flipped around the turn of the century. But Henry Lowe, John Jackson Brown, um, uh, Henry B. Crosby, these are some of the men. Oh, some of the men who were on the Underground Railroad who started the Republican Party. Another gentleman that's very important is Henry B. Crosby. Henry, and I gotta back up a little about Henry B. Crosby because he has a very interesting life as well as being an Underground Railroad agent. He also he comes to Patterson and he's actually a I won't say an architect, but he's a machinist, and he gets a job working for Samuel Colt. He's the one who actually perfects the Colt 45 revolver. They take it to Washington, and they were demonstrating the Colt revolver to one of the generals for the United States for the Army. And somehow or another, the gun goes off, scares a horse, and the horse takes off and it kills a man. And the army says, "We're not interested." They come back. Henry B. Crosby kind of separates from Samuel Colt, and he starts his own business. He becomes he was later named was called the Grocery King. Now, why I'm telling you about the Grocery King and Henry B. Crosby and John Jackson Brown is because these guys were grocers, but they were also the guys who were feeding the enslaved people who were coming through Patterson. Um, after John Jackson Brown uh, left his term was over as mayor, he left his position, and what they used to do is they used to hold Underground Railroad meetings in the bank building. The bank building was because there was no city hall, so the bank building was used as a city hall in the back room. And when the second mayor came in, whose name was Samuel Smith, he kicked him out. And they started having their meetings in the Oyster Bar on Main Street and Broadway. It was owned by Billy Langwood. Billy Langwood. Now, why his name is important? Because he not only did he own the Oyster Bar and Hotel, it was also a safe house. He also owned a stable with a string of horses. One of the ways that they used to move the enslaved people out of Patterson was to have a string of horses and have black folks who were tending these animals to move them to another town. And how they move them and be enslaved out is they take them where they were taking them, but they would never come back. So that was one of the ways that they were being moved out of the city of Patterson. Now I got to go back for a moment to Josiah P. Huntoon, who had the coffee and spice mill owner. And on his home was a cupola. And the cupola is like a little dome or a little rooftop thing where you could look out, and basically we might consider a skylight now. But anyway, the enslaved people would go into Garrett Mountain. And I mentioned that earlier, that Patterson being in the valley, and it's actually in a valley. And they would hide up there until the signal would come, until Mr. Huntoon would flash a signal from his cupola telling them to bring the enslaved into town. So he shined his light, and of course, Patterson was obviously was very flat then, and you probably could see several, maybe 5 or 6 miles because there was nothing. I mean, it was not even that many farms, not in Patterson. They were very small. The only farms that were in Patterson were around Eastside Park, and the Veland family owned those those farms. Now, so as the enslaved would come out, there were a number of ways they would come out. They'd come out of Garrett Mountain and go down an area called it's called the New Street. New Street is the oldest street in the city of Patterson, and it still exists, but it's not in use. And it is behind the great. It's behind the Great Falls. And as they would come down New Street, this matter of fact, New Street is where the Burger King is now in Patterson by the Great Falls. And at that time, it was a factory, and the factory was called the Ivanhoe Paper Mill. Now I don't know if enslaved people or people were. I know they were being ushered behind that building. And the superintendent of that building was an African American man, well, I shouldn't say African American, but a black man called Alfred Campbell Gibbs. Now, I hope I'm not rambling too much, and I hope I'm keeping you on track. But Alfred Gibbs was an abolitionist also, but he was also a publisher of a newspaper that started in 1851, didn't last very long, 1851 to 1852. It was an abolitionist newspaper and a temperance paper. So you can get all the news about slavery and the Underground Railroad from his newspaper. And I know that the enslaved were being moved behind his building, and some of them were being ushered across the Great Falls, well, the bridge at the Great Falls. Now, you may wonder, well, when was that bridge built? The first bridge that goes across the Passaic Falls was built in 1827 by Benjamin Crane. Why that's important? Because Benjamin Crane was an Underground Railroad agent. He was also a lumber. He also dealt in lumber, and he also dealt in marble. So they come down, go over that bridge, and go down what we know today as what we know today as Ryle Road. And as you go down Ryle Road, you get to the end of it, Ryle Road, and you get to the end of that, and you get to Ryle Avenue. Go across the street. Now you're on the other side of the river, which is considered in those days was Bergen County. And as you go down, and for those who may remember who may have lived in Patterson, which is now Presidential Boulevard, it was called Water Street. Why Water Street is important? Because Darius Wells lived on Water Street. Darius Wells was also an Underground Railroad agent. In fact, that his father was a captain for a number of skirmishes and battles that happened in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. Darius Wells became a very important part of the Underground Railroad because he was not only an agent, but he was a printer. And it's a long story about him, but I'll get right to what his real relationship was. He was appointed Patterson's first postmaster by Abraham Lincoln. And so in addition to him being an Underground Railroad agent and an abolitionist, he was also Patterson's first postmaster. And he lived on Water Street. His home was an Underground Railroad safe house. So after you would cross over the river, so now you're back on the Patterson side. And incidentally, Patterson doesn't become part of Passaic County to 1851. It becomes Patterson as a township in 1837. So they go across the river. So now you're back on the Patterson side, and the first place you would come in contact with is the African shore. This is when I start telling you before. It's the first African American community was established there around 1834. The churches, there was only one black church in Patterson from 1834 to 1865. And that church was called the Garden Street AME Zion Church. There are two denominations of African Methodist Episcopal. It's African American Episcopal. African American Episcopal was founded by Richard Allen, and African American Episcopal Zion was founded by, oh gosh, it's my mind right now. You'll come to me. But the founder is also from New York, and the headquarters church was in downtown and around the Wall Street area in New York. So 1834, you have the founding of the Godwin Street Amy Zion Church. Why that church is important? Because it was also an underground railroad stop. One of the members of that church was John Klein. John Klein is one of the founders of that church. And incidentally, his great grandson is Bill Klein, the councilman. And we're talking about Bill Klein from the 60s, who Bill Klein was the alderman and then the city council person for the fourth ward in during the 60s, in the 1960s. And it's very important because he helped bring Dr. King to Patterson in 1968. So the church, that one church became a very key and pivotal part of the Underground Railroad because, and oh gosh, I've so much information. Because I feel like because of the Underground Railroad and because it was the only Black church in the city of Patterson. Of course, religion was a big thing, and of course, the 1846 emancipation. Black folks were not allowed to congregate. They always felt that there was a problem with us congregating, and so we weren't. You were only allowed to have maybe 3 or 4 people, unless you were worshiping or a part of a church. Outside of the church, you couldn't do it. So you can see how important the church was as part of the Underground Railroad, as a place for mailing, a post office, for lack of a better word. The church became a pivotal point in that process. As the Underground Railroad grew, and I told you about some of the men who were part of it. What's so very important about Patterson is because it's an industrial city. It's not like the towns and cities in the South. Patterson was growing by leaps and bounds. By 1824, there were almost 5,000 people in Patterson. It's easy. And again, you had a lot of free Blacks living in Patterson too. As a matter of fact, Isabel Benson was a free Black, and she is listed on Patterson's directory in 1824. Why she's important to me is because she is the great-great-grand aunt of Gil Benson, who was once the president of the Patterson NAACP. Gil Benson, matter of fact, his sister is Cecile Dickey, who was the founder of what was it called? Child care. It's a daycare. It's a big daycare facility in Patterson. I can't think of the name of it. It'll come to me. The Head Start program. Cecile Dickey was part of that. So there were a lot of free Blacks in Patterson, not a lot. And again, to make it a little clearer, Patterson always had a very small Black community. You didn't have over 500 Black people in the city until after the turn of the 20th century. So there weren't a lot of Black people living here. and the ones who did or were here were most likely advocates, but they kept the advocates for the Underground Railroad, but they kept their heads down. And again, the ones that we do know of was John Klein, Godwin Street Amy Zion Church, and his wife, Harriet Klein. 1859 was a very pivotal moment, not just for Patterson, but it's also a pivotal moment as anti-slavery and the underground movement goes. 1859, John Brown, Harper's Ferry, the battle at Harper's Ferry. Well, of course, and that's another history story in itself. But anyway, what happened in 1859 is they thought that Frederick Douglass was with John Brown in Harper's Ferry, but he wasn't. Why it's important? I'm telling you this because he was in Hoboken. And the reason why he was in Hoboken, he was staying or being hidden by a good friend, and some consider his girlfriend, and her name, a white woman named Ottilio Assing. She lived in Hoboken. She was pretty well-to-do. Matter of fact, she sponsored a lot of his overseas excursion. Why she's important to Frederick Douglass and Patterson is while the slave catchers were looking for Frederick Douglass in 1859, he, under the cover of night, he comes to Patterson. And of course, to anybody who didn't know what he looked like, it would have just looked like a white woman was being driven by her slave or her chauffeur. He comes to Patterson for three reasons. I believe he comes to Patterson because he gets on the Erie train line that leaves from Patterson that goes, the first stop is in Suffern. He gets off that train, gets another train, and he goes to Rochester, where he lives with his three children and his wife. So I believe he comes to Patterson as a part of being a way to hide himself. That's number one. The second reason is I believe he may have come because he's a parishioner from the African and Methodist Episcopal Zion denomination. So he has church people here who knows who he is, and the people and the church that we're talking about is the church that most likely would have hidden him. The third reason is that you have the Anti-Slavery Society here. And I told you by 1850, there were 1,200 chapters along the east coast of the United States, Patterson being one of them. And so those are three reasons that Frederick Douglass might have come to Patterson in 1859. First and foremost, as a point of transportation. Second, because of the church. And third, because of the anti-slavery chapter. As the anti-slavery society, I mean, as the Underground Railroad moves and becomes a very pivotal part of the city, there are a lot of people who didn't like the Underground Railroad or didn't like slavery at all. And if I could digress for a minute, I talked about the Morris Canal. The Morris Canal was built by mostly Irish people. Mostly, there were some Italians, but yet there were Black people here. But the Irish refused to work with Black people. So because of that, they were excluded from that, even though they may have traveled it as part of their escape route. They never worked on the Morris Canal. And again, it has to do with being an escape route. Now I can go back to gosh, okay. I was talking about the various men who were part of the Underground Railroad. I'm going back again. I know I'm going backwards. We do have a number of men who were industrialists. You have John C. Benson. John C. Benson was a very important person because of the fact he was a textile mill owner. And being involved with textiles, and matter of fact, all the industries in Patterson, being involved with, you're not going to make them, you're not going to make them, you're not going to make your goods and keep them in Patterson. You're going to move that stuff out. So as you move it out of the city, these are ways that you move the enslaved out. There's another important reason why Patterson was a town that protected the enslaved. The first sheriff of the city of Patterson, whose name was Nathan Lane. Nathan Lane is Patterson's first Passaic County sheriff, and he was an Underground Railroad agent. So you're not going to give the sheriff any problems in terms of what you know, what you see, and how, and the movement of slaves out of the city of Patterson. Nathan Lane eventually ends up marrying Alexander Freeman. I spoke about him being a conductor on the Morris Canal. He marries his daughter, and they both become tinsmith after he retires from being the sheriff. They both become tinsmith since they own the business, not together, but he acquires his business at 42 Van Houten Street. Why that building is very important is because on that building was a tin dog. It's a wooden dog sheathed in tin, but it was an Underground Railroad marker. As a matter of fact, that is one of the two remaining artifacts on the Underground Railroad that still exists today. I own one, and the Passaic County Historic Society owns the tin dog.
Okay.
I think it's time for me to ask questions.
Yeah, but I actually just have to take privilege here. It was interesting about the sheriff because in other places in the United States, the sheriffs were turning people in and getting money under the Fugitive Slave Act. Right. So that made this a very unique experience. Thank you so much, Jimmy. Michael is sitting here. He grew up in Patterson, and he's saying, "I didn't know that. I didn't know that."
Well,
so,
Michael,
hey, Jimmy.
Yes. So, other questions anybody would like to ask?
Jimmy, you know that I was born on Water Street.
Oh, really?
Presidential Boulevard.
Yes.
On the banks of the Passaic River.
Yes.
Of course, those buildings are long gone.
Yes.
But that was during the era that you mentioned.
Well, not all the way back. Not all the way back. 1860.
I thought you lived on East 18th Street.
No, I grew up in the fourth ward.
Yeah.
But born in the first ward
on Water Street.
On Water Street.
Yeah. Are there any questions? Would anybody like to comment or have anything to say?
Did they know who the other people were that were on the Underground Railroad? Were they in touch with each other?
Are you talking about enslaved people or
agents? The people who were the helpers or the people who were the conductors.
I'm sure that there was a network. You know, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, there were 8 underground conductors, agents on the Morris Canal. That's just one small example. Let me say one other thing. There are no underground railroad stops in Bergen County, none. So once you got past Bergen County, you're on your own. But I'm sure, I don't know. Again, my research has been mostly around Patterson, that kind of area of Patterson, Passaic County. So, but I know that, matter of fact, there are 72 underground railroad stops in the state of New Jersey. And I think there are 14 in North Jersey. So yes, there is a line. There are four different underground routes that run through New Jersey. But so there is most definitely a connection. And most of these stops are near churches and near rivers. Not, of course, not all Passaic River, but near rivers throughout the state of New Jersey. So yes, there's a very long line of conductors and people, with the exception of Bergen County, that were Underground Railroad stops.
Jimmy, were there other places where the business community was so involved in helping people escape?
New Brunswick. New Brunswick was most certainly New Brunswick and Perth Amboy. Now, why? I'll do Perth Amboy first. Perth Amboy was a port of call for slavery. So when you would bring in your slaves from Africa or from the Caribbean, most likely you would have docked in Perth Amboy. So that's number one. So and talk about the business community. The second one being New Brunswick. New Brunswick is important because it is the river, or the way to get across the Raritan River, which have taken you north. Now, I have done some research, and I do believe that they may have been traveling along the Orange Mountain Range, which starts right at New Brunswick once you go over the Raritan River. If you go through those woods, it goes right through, I'm sorry, not Orange Mountain, the Watchung Range. That whole range starts in New Brunswick and goes right through Patterson. So, but as far as the business community in New Brunswick was a big stop. And again, they were always slave catchers posted in New Brunswick at the river.
Interesting. Are there any other questions? Anybody? Rabbi, any questions or comments?
No, I mean, like Mike, for me, it was all new information. Not something I knew anything about. So, well, very edifying.
Thank you.
One of the interesting things that Jimmy mentioned as he was going through the names is a lot of those names of yesteryear are street names in Patterson.
That's right. That's right.
Henry, you must remember some of those too as a Patterson guy.
Right.
Crosby Place.
That's right.
Downtown.
That's right.
They're all over the place. All of those names. Ryle Avenue.
Beckwith Avenue.
All of those names from yesteryear are all names of Patterson streets all over there today.
And Jimmy, just tell people a little bit who have any of you been to the Patterson to see the statue of Huntoon by the underground? Tell them a little bit about that, Jimmy.
All right.
We sign off.
The Underground Railroad was designated, the Underground Railroad, no, Josiah Huntoon's home, no, his factory was designated an Underground Railroad Municipal Historic Site in 1996. Dolores Van Rensselaer, who is I'll be nice tonight, Marilyn, I'll be nice tonight, who is a descendant of William Van Rensselaer, she wrote a book called Bridge Street to Freedom. And in writing that book, she really galvanized the African American community, and they wanted to make that a sacred site. So she, over the course of time, we reached out to Ed Dwight. Ed Dwight is a African American sculptor. As a matter of fact, he has designed, I think, over 1,200 statues, including the ones at the Kellogg sculptures in Kansas City, I believe. I mean, he's got them all over the country. But anyway, Ed Dwight is the first African-American astronaut candidate. The reason why he dropped out of the candidate school is because of racism. He got involved with sculpturing, and he was commissioned by the Patterson Parking Authority along with Dolores Van Rensselaer to design this sculpture. The sculpture, which is not many people know, the real name of the sculpture is called On Wings of Freedom. And if you go online, you'll see a picture of this, and Google Patterson's Underground Railroad, you'll see a picture of this statue. Some people, when it first came out, they said it looked like a rocket with wings or a plane or something. But anyway, it's called On Wings of Freedom. The monument or the statue actually cost $200,000, which was paid in part by the Patterson Parking Authority and the Patterson freeholders, who are commissioners now. There are papers there with people's names on it who contributed to that, including Marilyn and Mike Rubin. They have a brick that's there. Every year since, and again, it was unveiled in 2014. So we're coming up on the 10th anniversary, which I'm going to be doing a big program on Juneteenth in honor of that 10th anniversary. It is most certainly the mecca for most African American. It's a starting point and a mecca for most African American programming. That like Juneteenth, like the Heritage Parade, all those events really start at the Underground Railroad. The Passaic County Community College takes a little credit for being part of it, but it's not how you think. They take credit for being part of the Underground Railroad because of the bridge that connects the college with the parking authority. So that is the connection with the Passaic County Community College and the Underground Railroad. There's so much more I could say about that sculpture and that statue. But when you go online Monday and you look at the website, it will answer a lot of other questions that you may have about that.
Growing up in Patterson in the 50s, I remember hearing that there was a drugstore or a pharmacy.
Mears
what was it called?
Mears Drugstore. It was by David Meir, and he after Josiah Huntoon died in 1891, David Meir purchased that drugstore. Now, why that drugstore is very important to the African American community is because he is one of the few druggists who would make special compounds. Now, I'm sure he was probably making things that he'd get arrested for today, but people coming from the South, people coming from other countries, they may have wanted a remedy that you're not going to find anywhere, and he would make that. I did meet, if I may, I tell you this, I met a gentleman whose name was Robert Bernelli, and he's older than me. He lives in Wyckoff now. And he, as a boy, he used to be the delivery guy, the delivery boy for David Neal. Actually, it was passed down to his son, whose name is Rush Nears. And he told me, and he described what underneath that store looked like. Now I got to explain something. The drugstore is a former home of Josiah Huntoon. So his home becomes the drugstore. And he described what the basement looked like with planks. The water, he said, the water, and again, the water table is so high that the basement was always flooded with water. Now, you have to understand, the nearest drugstore is got to be a good 1,500 feet from the river. But I guess, and again, it's coming up a hill, but the water table was so high, the basement was always flooded. So with that being said, there were always planks on the floor. They had cribs where the enslaved people could hide and sleep until they were moved to their next station. There were always places where food was being kept. And I talked to you about John Brown and Henry B. Crosby being grocers who most likely had supplied a lot of that food. They most certainly couldn't live on coffee alone. So yes, nearest drugstore. And again, when you, and I hope I keep selling it, I hope you look at the website because there's a film that I produced of the demolition of that drugstore in 1983. And you will see the demolition of that drugstore. Of course, what if we knew, we you know what, we always knew the significance of it, but they wanted to build the police station and a couple other things, and that's how that drugstore got torn down. And after 1996, when the African American community came together, that's when they parceled off that land to become a sacred place for African Americans. And I'm talking about the Underground Railroad. So to answer your question, you're talking about David and Rush Nears drugstore. In fact, it was the kind of drugstore that supplied a lot of the drugs for the hospitals, which there were only two. This was before the Barnet, for St. Joe's and for the General, which was called the Ladies Hospital. So they have a long-standing history with the drug industry within Patterson. As a matter of fact, it was described. I remember, I do, and the gentleman who asked me that question probably remembers too. I remember what this store looks like in between, in the inside. It had a tile floor, not too different from what tile floors are today, but history tells us there was something in the floor that told you it was an Underground Railroad stop. They had this giant scale on the left-hand side of the room, and I'm talking about a big penny scale. And I remember getting on that scale, and there was a wooden bench where you would wait for your prescriptions.
Wow, it's so interesting. And just one other thing, and then we can call it an evening. But Jimmy also told me that the Barnet Hospital was built for a very specific reason, because just tell people why the Barnet Hospital was built, Jimmy.
All right. It starts with the St. Joseph's Hospital, which was built in 1867. It was built in 1867, and then they moved to, then the General Hospital, it was built in 1867. Now, the problem, or the observation is, St. Joseph's is a Catholic hospital. They would take anybody, black, white, zebra, all nationalities and denominations, nationalities at St. Joe's, but they would not allow African American doctors nor Jewish doctors to practice at St. Joe's. That is why the General Hospital was built in 1871 by the Protestant women of Patterson, and most of them may have come from First Baptist Church, which is also, it was not an Underground Railroad stop, but a lot of the Underground Railroad agents worshiped there. So, matter of fact, on the corner of Broadway and Patterson Street, where the Board of Health is now, that used to be Harry B. Crosby's home, and after that, it became the first center the first Jewish health center. I believe it was the first Jew, and it was manned by Dr. Barnum. Dr. Barnum. And so on the corner of Broadway and Patterson Street is where the first Jewish, how can I say though? What's the word I want to say? A place where you get health care. But most certainly, healthcare. Thank you. It was most certainly catered to the Jewish community, which was growing. Matter of fact, was growing to be a large community. So in 1919, you have the establishment of the Barnett Hospital on 28th Street, or the 29th? 28th Street, I think. Am I right, Mike?
And that was the place where the Jewish community coalesced for medical care.
But if I could go back, I'm sorry, Marilyn, I know you want to kick me out. But the other thing is,
I was born at the General Hospital.
You too?
My children were born in the Barnett Hospital.
Really?
Yes.
I'm from Mike, me and you together. I'm from the General also. But we were talking about, if I may, the Jewish community and the Black community grew up together in the Fourth Ward. We're in the area, down in that area where Mike grew up. And I'm saying that because I believe that the Jewish community was very important with the Underground Railroad, even though I have not found any ties to it other than a gentleman named Elijah Finkel. Elijah Finkel he's not from this area, but I believe, and I think I asked Marilyn once before, is Elijah Finkel Jewish? And it just sounds like he might have been. I've tried to find out. I even wrote to, and it's a long story, because he dies in Columbia County, Connecticut. Columbia County, Connecticut. And I was telling you about Harry Jackson. Harry Jackson, I never finished telling you that. Harry Jackson worked for Elijah Finkel. How he got to work for him is Harry Jackson from Patterson, the runaway slave, was a stevedore. Harry Finkel asked him, did he want to work for him? He says, yes. He goes back to his farm in Columbia County, Connecticut. In the 1860 census, he changes his name from Harry Jackson to Harry Finkel. 1865, his name is back to Harry Jackson. So I do think that the Jewish community may have some ties to the Underground Railroad that we just don't know about, and we're still investigating.
Well, you can come back at another time and find out more about that and share it with us. Well, I'd like to thank you for a fascinating talk about certainly telling me about a lot of things I didn't know. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. And for Jimmy, you have an amazing storehouse of knowledge. You know, I always think that. And thank you for spending time with us and sharing only a small part of your knowledge with us. And Rabbi, thank you for hosting this. And Sherry, thank you for helping to put all of this together. And so I hope you have a wonderful evening. And I'd like a rousing round of applause for Jimmy Richardson. Thank you very, very much. And I hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much for allowing me to come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks. Good
And
night.
Marilyn, thank you very much. And
you're
thank
welcome,
you, Jimmy.
Sherry. You're welcome. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.